This is Dan Schneider. This is not a Dan Schneider video interview. I'm starting a new series with Mitchell Hadley. Those who have watched the Dan Schneider video interviews, almost 400 of them, know that Mitch has appeared a handful of times, and in the last couple of months he's appeared a couple of times and will appear in future episodes talking about individual great shows. But when Mitch recontacted me after a few years, a few months ago, I had an idea that had been brewing in my mind of doing sort of a decade by decade scouring of American television. And with Mitch contacting me, I figured, well, he's the perfect guy to do it with. So this is what it's going to be called. It's going to be called American Television with Mitchell Hadley, and I'll be hosting. And we'll just be talking about the various different decades from the 40s through the 2010s, 2020s actually. And then we'll also maybe occasionally have some special episodes, very special episodes on things like family dramas or whatever comes, maybe the BBC model versus the American model of television, whatever it comes to. But Mitch, welcome. Just
Thank you,
before we
Dan.
just before we start, if you could give a little background about who you are.
Sure, I'm a classic TV historian. I specialize in, if you can call it that, in looking at the effect that classic TV's had on American culture and American history and how the two of them come together so that TV can be seen as something of a time capsule showing the evolution of American culture throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. My website is itsabouttv.com, where I blog about everything from TV guides to specific TV shows to looking at incidences of how TV has evolved and how it's portrayed the country at various times in its history. And I've also written a book about that is a collection of essays from the website as well as some original content that is exclusive to the book, and that's called The Electronic Mirror, because TV really is an electronic mirror that we hold up to ourselves and we see what our world and our history is all about.
So let's do a little background about television. I, I know that the major networks got started in the late 40s after World War II, but there were assorted expositions and world fairs that did have television as early as the 1920s.
Yes.
And yet it wasn't until after the Second World War that, at least in America, it became started to get television in every home. So what was like the earliest broadcast here in the U.S. and was it the first, or did Germany or England beat us out, or do you know?
Well, I think that if you go all the way back, one of the things that television had as an advantage in this country was that RCA and NBC were one unit. RCA owned NBC, and since RCA would go on to make television sets just as they had been making radio sets, they really had an incentive to get involved in this technology at the very outset. So as early as 1928, RCA was experimenting with television. The first TV star, actually, and I always enjoy looking at this, is that Felix the Cat.
Mm.
He appeared in an experimental broadcast way back in 1928, and they had a small Felix the Cat statue that they placed on a rotating base, and he was the ideal character because he was black and white. So you'd get a very crisp image, relatively speaking. And because he was a statue, he wasn't going to melt under the hot lights that they needed to operate the cameras at that point in time. So David Sarnoff, who was the major domo of NBC RCA at the time, was working with this in 1928, and the first television broadcast in the United States actually happened in 1928 on an experimental station in Schenectady, New York, I believe, which is where RCA had, I think, one of their operations. And it was a 40-minute drama that was actually written for this presentation. It wasn't broadcast to any kind of an audience, but it was being used as a way of experimenting whether or not they were on the right track. You go through the 30s, and there are just some mileposts that are really pretty interesting to look at. You've got the Hollywood Reporter in 1934 saying the television is ready, the commercial TV is just around the corner. And then you've got an experimental TV station in Los Angeles that is doing broadcasts, again, not commercially, not to a wide audience, but they're working on it. And you've got, I think one of the most interesting facts that I came across was that 1936, Walt Disney at that point has a deal with United Artists for distribution. And in 36, Disney tells United Artists, I want to retain the television rights to all of my films. And UA says, no, we're not going to give you that. And so Disney moves over to RKO, where he does have the right. And you see that in the late 40s into the 50s, as Disney becomes more and more involved with TV, you see the foresight that Disney had in wanting to make sure that he had the rights to broadcast his programs on television. Very shrewd. But to come directly to your point, I think we can probably start with the World's Fair in New York in 1939. The World of Tomorrow, the storied World's Fair. And in 39, TV makes its debut. NBC covers the opening of the World's Fair. The next day, they broadcast a speech by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And they begin regular broadcasts on their experimental station in New York. Now, you've only got maybe a few hundred televisions in all of America at that point, but they're starting to work with it. There are 2 or 3 television stations in New York, and they're starting to send their signals out. NBC is very clever about how they're publicizing it. You know, you think, well, how do you get the word out about TV? If people don't have TV in their homes, you can't advertise on TV. You can do some advertising on the radio, but how do you advertise a product that allows you to see pictures in a medium where you can't see pictures? So what NBC started to do, they took some cameras to Atlanta for the world premiere of Gone with the Wind. And they stationed 5 cameras around the theater in Atlanta where the movie premiered, and they televised the premiere, not the movie itself, but what we would think of today probably as the red carpet show. And so it was through special events like that that they started to get the word out about television and started to let people know that this was a coming thing. And it also, by the way, allowed RCA to become influential in establishing the standards for television. To sidetrack for just a moment, but I think it is important, the movie industry had also seen the power of television and the potential that it had. And so the movie industry wanted to get involved with TV as well, but they had a slightly different idea of how they wanted TV to work. Whereas RCA was going to look at the NBC commercial radio model for television. In other words, you have programs that are broadcast free on television, and their production is supported by ad revenue generated by commercials. The movie theaters thought of television as what we would now think of as pay-per-view, that they'd be able to beam their movies into homes where people would pay for the opportunity to see it. And they thought, well, we can do this with movies. We can do it with sporting events. We can do it with operas and concerts and special event programming. So they are interested in TV, but they're interested in doing something else with it. And very early on, the Federal Communications Commission had to determine what the standards were going to be for TV when it started out. Because RCA is involved in it, they are heavily promoting their commercial television idea. And they're also capitalizing on concerns that the federal government is starting to have about monopolization by movie theaters, that by the studios, that they're starting to monopolize the distribution of their pictures into theaters that they also own. So, because of those monopoly concerns on the part of the federal government, and because of Sarnoff's ability to lobby and to influence how the FCC was going to decide this, it winds up that the model that's favored by the FCC is the commercial television model. And so that's what we see really start to come alive. And by the time of World War II, there is broadcasting going on. You mentioned Germany. In 1936, in the Summer Olympics in Berlin, those were televised in Germany. They actually had a network set up where you could watch the Olympics being broadcast from the Olympic Stadium in Berlin, in Germany and other parts of Europe. Now, that technology stopped essentially when World War II started in Europe. But we're not stopping in the United States quite yet because we're not involved in World War II. So we come to Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941. There's a television station operating in New York at the time, and they interrupt their regular broadcasting for bulletins that Pearl Harbor's been attacked by the Japanese. They don't have any video of it, of course. And what they're really doing is reading wire service copy, and they're reading the copy that NBC Radio has used, because radio did break the story. But they preempt their entire afternoon schedule to broadcast war news and to show what's going on, what the latest is in Pearl Harbor. The next day, they broadcast Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech asking for a declaration of war. Now, the station doesn't have any setup inside the Capitol to be able to actually televise the speech. So, what they did was show an American flag while broadcasting the radio sound of Roosevelt speaking. But again, if you were one of the few that had a television set in New York in 1941, you're seeing both the bulletins on Pearl Harbor and you're hearing Roosevelt's speech the next day. After that, things die down. There is no more development during the war. There are broadcasts still. They're still using the technology that they've had, but they're not doing any more with it. They're not advancing anywhere. But that kind of brings us right up to the beginning of the decade. Already a lot of history has happened, but now the industry is poised that it's going to take off once we get to the end of the war.
So, just for anyone like coming across this decades or centuries hence after a nuclear holocaust, let's just set the record straight. RCA was the Radio Corporation of America.
Correct.
NBC was National Broadcasting Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I know, my little knowledge about television and radio, back from the teens, 20s, 30s, there were basically two national broadcast radio networks. There was NBC
Correct.
and CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting Systems.
Mm-hmm.
By the 1940s, I think what would eventually become the American Broadcasting Corporation broke off from NBC. There was like
Right.
NBC Red,
NBC
NBC
had
Blue.
Yep, NBC had what was called the Blue Network and the Red Network,
Yeah.
and they were separate networks in that each one had their own set of affiliates, and some of their biggest programming was broadcast over both Blue and Red, but for the most part, each of those two networks had their own programming. Government gets involved in that and basically breaks up NBC's control of the two networks. So I think, I want to say it's the Blue Network that gets spun off and undergoes new ownership, and that ownership eventually renames the Blue Network the American Broadcasting Company. And so at the time that ABC joins the process, they have two major drawbacks. The first is that they don't have the huge network of radio affiliates that NBC and CBS did. And that's important because once the decision had been made not to follow the motion picture model, but to more or less go off of the radio model, you had radio stations becoming heavily involved as owners of local stations and affiliates of the network. Since ABC is at a disadvantage there, they're starting out far behind where NBC and CBS are. The second point to keep in mind is that ABC at that point in history was not the third network. They were actually the fourth network. The third network was Dumont. And Alfred Dumont, I think that was his first name. I'm just going off the top of my head again, but Dumont was involved in technology like RCA. He was a manufacturer of sets, television sets, and Dumont had originally received funding from Paramount Pictures, hoping that Dumont would be their theater TV entry into the scene. Eventually, Dumont winds up setting up his own television network. And Dumont is suffering in a way from an even bigger problem than ABC because Dumont has no network affiliations whatsoever. There is no Dumont radio, there's only Dumont television. And so Dumont usually winds up as a filler station. You still don't have programming that is going throughout the broadcast day. Some networks broadcast most, but not all of the prime time hours. Some of them don't broadcast anything during the day, but a test pattern. There's kind of an irregularity as to how things are being broadcast. And so if you're a CBS affiliate or an NBC affiliate and your network doesn't have any programming in, say, the 7 to 8 o'clock hour, you might pick up what Dumont has. And so Dumont wound up doing that and also providing programming to unaffiliated or independent stations. So Dumont has a presence. They actually have some fairly well-known shows that mostly extend into the early 50s, but Captain Video was one of their first shows. Jackie Gleason's Cavalcade of Stars, Bishop Sheen's Life is Worth Living. They had some well-known shows, but they weren't really able to keep them. Most of them wound up going to other networks. And in the 50s, Dumont finally phases out altogether. And that leaves us with the big three, CBS, NBC, and ABC. Those are the networks that we'll have until Fox comes along in the 80s.
So one of the things with Dumont network, and you mentioned independent television stations. How many were there? I mean, we think now, and going back to the 70s and stuff when I was a kid, there was the Chicago Superstation TBS. No, was it TBS?
WGN in Chicago. TBS
yeah,
is in Atlanta. Yeah.
WPIX, WOR in New York.
Mm-hmm.
What did the big cities have independent? At least a couple of independent stations, and where would they get their material if not from a network?
Yeah, most of the big cities by the early 50s would have at least one independent network, and I think KTLA might have been one of the best known independent networks. I might be wrong that it was a different station, but I know KTLA was very prominent in Los Angeles, and they were they did a lot of on the spot type coverage. They were very prominent throughout that area, but just about every large city had one independent station. Some had more. Some of those programs would come from independent production companies like Ziv, and I think Ziv is probably best known for shows like Highway Patrol, Sea Hunt, science fiction theater, different half-hour dramas that are inexpensively made, but they're popular. They send them out by cans of film initially to different affiliates where they're able to be broadcast. You also have movies that can be shown, not recent movies for the most part, because in this power struggle between the motion picture industry and television, now that the studios have lost out on this opportunity to build from the ground up with their theater TV pay-per-view model, they're very reluctant to offer programming to the networks. So you do have movies that are being shown on independent stations and on affiliates for that matter, but they're very old movies to that point. We're talking about movies from the 30s, maybe the early 40s by the end of the late 40s, but they're not box office hits. They're not blockbusters. Some of them will go on to be cult movies, film noirs, things like that. The bulk of the time, though, that most of these independent stations and in fact many affiliates for that matter, the bulk of the time gets filled by local programming. And local shows at this point in time are the feeder system for the networks. So you have most of the coming stars on network television coming from their work in local television. I can think of Ed McMahon, for example, cut his teeth in local television. Ernie Kovacs was a huge star in Philadelphia. In fact, the Kovacs morning show was so popular in Philadelphia that the NBC affiliate chose to show that instead of the nascent Today Show. And it's finally NBC that lays down the law and says, look, if you're going to be an affiliate, you're going to show our programming. And so Kovacs moves on to another one of his experiments. But Kovacs got his start that way. Mike Douglas was hosting a music program in New York, or not New York, Chicago. I'm sorry. You've got the Jinx Falkenberg, the very popular personality of the time. She's on local television in New York. And you really have Dave Garroway, before he went to the Today Show, was a Chicago personality. And at this point, you're not really sure where the future of television lies. You've got what's called the Chicago School, because they're obviously producing quite a few um, future stars of television. You've got Philadelphia, which has its proximity to New York, but is also producing homegrown stars. You've got New York City itself, which has this huge supply of theater actors who are looking for the opportunity to break into TV and therefore eventually into the movies. So those three cities all have claims in the early going to becoming the center of American television. It isn't until the 50s, until you get to I Love Lucy, that California even begins to enter the picture, other than as an occasional source of programming. You've got the for one thing, you don't have a nationwide cable that can get programming out to California until late in the 40s or early 50s. So you've got transmission problems there. But for another thing, movie stars aren't crazy about getting into TV. They don't see a positive for them. Their studios certainly don't see a positive for them unless they're going to figure out a way to use television to promote their movies. But the last thing they want to do again is set up television as a direct competitor. So that's kind of what the scene is at that point in time. You have a thriving local broadcasting history. They're doing made for TV plays, they're staging operas, they're doing all kinds of very creative programming in their studios, and they are having a lot of their shows as well as their stars imported into network television. You look at some of the shows of the late 40s and early 50s on the networks, they came from local television.
So before we start talking about some of the shows of the 40s and network schedules and that kind of thing, let's just backtrack a little bit. I want to talk about the American versus the British model of television, because it was in the 1940s, we're still 2 decades away from the formation of public television or
Right.
educational television. So was there concern because you had the comics code that came in the late 50s. You still had the movie codes. So there was all of this. I think you had the Catholic League of Decency for
Yep.
movies and whatnot. What pressures did the networks and Congress face on sort of corralling, making sure this was a family-friendly medium uh, in what would seem to be more Wild West days where people are experimenting?
hmm Well, that's really a good point because early on, one of the trademarks of television is that it is the most intimate of communications media, even more so than radio, because with television you have the picture as well as the sound. But very early, I think, in television's development, the people doing TV understood that their proper role was as an invited guest into the living room. And so they approached it from that standpoint. They felt that there were certain standards they needed to follow as a guest in the living room. They conducted themselves in a particular way. Jack Parr, for example, when we get to the 50s, Jack Parr always told his guests to use use a slightly lower voice. Don't be quite the way you might be in the during the day or in the evening because you're talking to people in their bedrooms at midnight. So you need to have kind of what today I suppose we'd call our indoor voice as opposed to our outdoor voice. But um, there was the television code was in existence at that point in time, and it was sort of the TV equivalent of the motion picture code. It wasn't hard and fast. It wasn't a law as much as it was a series of suggestions. But what the government hoped to be able to do, rather than regulate television, was threaten television, maybe in a very friendly manner. But what they wanted to do was remind these stations that they had to apply for renewal of their broadcast licenses on a regular basis. And that if people were encouraged to send letters to the FCC on how they felt the affiliates were serving what was broadly considered the public interest. What that especially means is if you don't think your station is acting in the public interest, let us know. What that meant in practical terms was, although I don't believe any affiliate was ever denied a license renewal based on the feeling that they did not act in the public interest. And if there were any, it was a very small number. But it was that possibility that they could lose their license that hung over the station managers and owners and reminded them that they did have a certain interest in making sure that they provided adequate programming for the public. And by adequate, I would say everything from religious programming to family friendly programming to programming that did not offend, that didn't deal with offensive topics, to programs that had a certain level of morality to them. And by that, there are so many different examples. A tobacco company would tell, because at this point, I should mention that at this point, the main sponsors of television are also the producers of television. So if you're a tobacco company, if you're Winston, you buy the time from the network and then you produce the show that is going to go into that time slot. That doesn't mean that you're making it a propaganda piece, but it means you're controlling that show and you're sponsoring that show. So they are free to give instructions to the directors and the writers as to just what they don't want to see in these shows. A tobacco company would say, we don't want to see the bad guys smoking because we don't want to have people associate cigarette use with criminals. A coffee company would tell the maker of a TV show, a British war drama, for example, that your British submarine commander cannot be drinking a cup of tea on the bridge. He's got to be drinking a cup of coffee because we don't want to be sponsoring a show that's advocating the use of a competitive product. When Rod Serling wound up doing The Twilight Zone, one of the reasons he gravitated towards science fiction was to stop this kind of pressure he was getting from advertisers and from the networks themselves to avoid controversial programming. So that's part of it as well. You've got sponsor pressure, and you do though generally have an understanding on the part of the stations that they need to be careful about what they're showing. You're not going to show a drama where the criminal succeeds in the end. You're not going to have a show that ends ambiguously. If you are adapting a well-known story like um, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which was done on CBS's Playhouse 90, you're going to give Heart of Darkness a more positive ending than the actual story has. One that's going to be more palatable to the audience and one that's going to be easier for the audience to understand. The message involved is anything from crime does not pay to good always triumphs over evil in the end. Now, as television becomes more sophisticated, and this will be pushed off into our discussions of other decades, but as TV becomes more sophisticated, you'll see writers and directors and actors wanting to deal with more sophisticated problems. But in these early days of television, you're going to be very careful about that content, and you're going to be very careful about the way in which you show any of that happening. If you're going to have um, shootouts, you may show people getting shot off screen, that kind of thing. So you've got the television code, you've got the TV code bug that a lot of people will notice at the end of the credits on shows of the 50s and 60s. But you've got these kinds of things that are kind of acting as a handbrake on television to keep them from getting too far gone with what their content is going to be.
So, people our age probably still remember that in the 1970s, at least, prime time had always started till about 7:30, and then they
Hmm.
got rid of that in the mid 70s with the prime time access rule. And
Right.
so it's interesting when I was looking back at the link you showed me of the schedule formatting there. Prime time was from 7:30 to I guess 10 p.m. In the East Coast, an hour earlier in the Central. Then it was taped or whatnot for Mountain, and then
Hmm.
prime time was still I think 8 to 11 out on the West Coast. But as you said, it was very spotty. There was a lot of holes. It was very Swiss cheese there. Um, when did things formally become prime time? That people would watch Uncle Milton Berle
Hmm.
every week. And what was there any pressure from local stations? And you mentioned how sometimes local stations would be off. People don't remember too. At nighttime, stations would sign off, and you see the flag, and you hear
Yep. The
Star
national
Spangled
anthem,
Banner. Yeah,
sermonette,
yeah,
something
yeah,
like
something
that.
like that. And so when did all of these things come together? Was
Mhm.
it early on in the 40s?
By the time, well, even when you get into the mid 50s, when I'm looking at some of the old TV guides that I write about, you'll see in the mid 50s still awfully spotty schedules in places. Not from the networks so much, because by the end of the 40s, the networks have their prime time schedules fairly settled. I think it's 1948 when the four networks all have primetime schedules, but you still have a lot of variation from station to station where they'll be showing local programming, they'll be picking up programming from another network, depending on how many local stations affiliates you have in a certain area. In in my case, I can give you a case in the 1970s where I lived, which was a rural area, and we had the only TV station we had was a joint NBC ABC affiliate. And because it was the only station in the area, and because it was servicing a rural population, they were very sensitive toward the kinds of programming that their audience preferred. So instead of an urban comedy like Sanford and Son, they would take the feed from ABC and they would show something that their audience could identify with more. I was going to say Lawrence Welk, but actually, by the time by the time Sanford and Son came along, Lawrence Welk was in first run syndication, so they would show Lawrence Welk instead of Sanford and Son in that situation. But they would preempt NBC programming to carry shows like Welk or like Marcus Welby, MD, shows that skewed to what we would call an older demographic because that was the demographic of their rural audience. And so even in the 1950s, because you still have a lot of areas that only have one or two stations, you see a lot of that affiliate sharing going on, either formally or informally. But by the end of the decade of the 40s, the networks have pretty much figured out what they want for prime time and what they're going to be showing. And they have a very interesting lead in to prime time. And this is what the first thing I thought about when you brought that up. The network news is only 15 minutes long. And the network news will air for anywhere from 5 to 7 p.m., depending on your station. And because it's only 15 minutes long, they're sharing the rest of the half hour with a network music program. Um, Dinah Shore started out on TV with a 15-minute program that would run 3 days a week. As the second part of the half hour that the news was broadcast. Eddie Fisher had his own music show. Perry Como had his show starting out as a 15-minute program. So there were a lot of these half hours that were made up of the network news and a network variety show. Eventually, the variety shows go away, and the second half of the network news half hour winds up becoming either a local news 15 minutes or some kind of a short film or something like that. And a lot of times those wind up being broadcast in the 7 o'clock Eastern time zone. So you have news and maybe entertainment from 7 to 7:30, and then from 7:30 to 11 you have the formal prime time schedule. By 11 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Central, the networks are done.
Mhm.
And you don't even have any network programming after the local news until you get into a show like Jerry Lester's Broadway Open House, which is the first nighttime network show be broadcast in what we'd call the late night time slot. And after that, then you have Steve Allen with his Tonight Show, and then they try another show after Steve Allen goes off. It's called America After Dark. It's really a late night version of the Today Show. It's even hosted by Jack LaScooley, who was Dave Garroway's sidekick on the Today Show. That doesn't work out so well. They realize it's the variety show that belongs in that time slot, and the Tonight Show comes on, and it's remained to this day in that point. But yes, I would say by the end of the 40s we have the formal outline of what network broadcasting is going to be. It's always going to be subject to change at the local level, but it's pretty much established as what it's going to be.
Before I dig in a little more deeply into the primetime schedule, during the day you have now, not that there are that many soap operas left, but you have network soap operas. You have like things like The Talk and The View, these talk shows that are produced by the networks. What was the morning and afternoon before
Mhm,
prime time like for most television stations in the big cities, at least?
mhm.
Were there like you said, there were stars in Philadelphia like Kovacs that went on to greater acclaim. But what was it all just like little local things? What would become things like Romper Room or Captain Kangaroo for kids? Was it just baking, TV shows?
Hmm. That, yeah, pretty much. I mean, you had the Today Show. Um, Pat Weaver's idea of actually doing a network program at 7 o'clock in the morning, and that was unheard of idea. And people were convinced it was going to fail, but Weaver had a very shrewd eye for that kind of thing. People wondered who's going to watch television in the morning. Well, women who stay at home are going to watch television in the morning. Men on their way to work having breakfast, they're going to watch television in the morning before they head out of the house. So today becomes the first network program on at that hour. And I'm sorry, CBS will eventually follow suit with a show called The Morning Show. It's hosted first by Walter Cronkite, and then Jack Parr, and then Dick Van Dyke. Cronkite's co-hosts are the Baird Puppets. So you have great pictures of Cronkite sharing the screen with lions and other kinds of puppets. But they function not as hard news shows, but as soft variety shows that are appropriate to that time of the day and um, are shows that the housewives are going to stop and watch. Otherwise, you've got shows like Romper Room. You have children's shows that will, some of them migrate to the networks. You have a show like Captain Kangaroo that will come along that will become the network standard for what children's shows are supposed to be like. You have a lot of stations still into the mid 60s that won't be signing on until 10 o'clock in the morning. They're just going to be either static or a test pattern until then. You have some stations that are going to be showing movies. You have the cooking shows, the home shows. You have another show that Pat Weaver comes up with called Home, and it's hosted by Arlene Francis. It's broadly considered women's news because it's dealing with a lot of topics that housewives and women would be interested in. But it that to just relegate it to that would be to sell Arlene Francis short, because she was a very sharp lady and had a great eye for what's working on television. People remember her from What's My Line on CBS, but she's also got this show on NBC, and so she does some very informative things, some very newsworthy topics get covered on a program like that. And then you have game shows. They were called quiz shows at the time, and I think they wound up becoming game shows because in the 50s you have the quiz show scandals, which we'll probably get into when we're covering the 50s. Those mostly concern prime time programs, but some of those time programs migrated from daytime. So you did have daytime game shows on that were filling some of the hours as well. The soap operas, most of them were coming over from radio. So in the early decades of television, they followed the radio format of a 15-minute program. It wasn't until the early 60s that you began to see the half-hour format become the standard for soap operas. And as late as 1967, I think it was, you still had I think it was The Secret Storm and The Guiding Light. I could be wrong about that, but CBS still had a half an hour block consisting of two 15-minute soap operas as late as 1967. And then they all go to a half hour. Shortly after that, they go to an hour. One of them even goes to an hour and a half, and then they gradually go away too. But at that point in time, the soap opera is very much borrowing both the show and the format of the radio version. Some local stations will show movies during the day. Many of them show after school programs for kids. So you'll have shows like The Lone Ranger, Hopalong Cassidy, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. Um, Howdy Doody, one of the most famous shows of the late 40s into the 50s. Somebody once referred to Howdy Doody as Milton Berle for kids because it had the same level of chaos and hyper energy and adrenaline flowing. So, Howdy Doody, the Mickey Mouse Club, different shows like that. There was an understanding that from maybe 3 o'clock until the news hour comes along, that is mostly reserved for kids. So that's your kids block. And then you get into the news, a little bit of local programming in prime time.
Yeah, the 1940s was the original decade of, I guess we'd call it reality TV. Because looking at the schedule, you have some singing shows, you have shows where people, local people, bully pulpits where they're discussing local issues. You've got the beginnings of the live television golden era, 1950s stuff. But just looking at, and you've got local cities with broadcasting their baseball and
Hmm.
games and what. But without a doubt, the thing that stands out as dominant here is boxing and pro wrestling. And
Yes.
a few years ago, I did a novel about Gorgeous George, the wrestler. And one of the things that the taglines about that particular individual is that in the 1940s he sold more televisions than Uncle Milty, and
Hmm.
and just to put it on a par with what we know now is they would get when they would broadcast wherever. It wasn't like the WWF or WWE where they hadn't come along yet. So you would have people like Gorgeous George who would go in LA, he'd wrestle in Chicago and New York or whatnot, and you could follow him, the tapes of his matches, and people think of a Hulk Hogan or a Dwayne the Rock Johnson or wrestlers like that, Steve Austin, but I mean in terms of public consciousness, everyone, even if they didn't watch wrestling, knew who Gorgeous George was. I mean
Absolutely.
he was like a movie star's movie star. Um, what talk a little bit about number one wrestling and then also the Friday night fights where
Hmm.
people like Sugar Ray Robinson and Raging Bull, Jake
Jake
LaMotta
LaMotta,
and
yeah.
whatnot were TV stars too.
Well, wrestling and boxing, because they have the same basic layout. You have the ring, and you have the seating area around the ring, and the fans are very close to the ring, and you can pretty much cover each of them with. You can have one camera. You can splurge and have a couple of cameras, but they're perfect vehicles for television because they're very easy to set up, they're very inexpensive to show. Almost every major city has a boxing club, a wrestling club. And when you talk about somebody like Gorgeous George going from city to city, most of these cities had their own local wrestling programs in addition to the national wrestling program that might be on Dumont with Dennis James, incidentally, who a lot of people will remember as a game show host. But Dennis James was a popular host of wrestling programs. His catchphrase, "Oh, okay, mother," when he was a big name in that. But because they're easy to telecast and because they fit very easily into this good guy, bad guy scenario that we had talked about, because they're very emotional, people can get into them easily. There's audience participation of a kind when one of the wrestlers goes out of the ring, and you might have the little old lady with the handbag whopping him on the side of the head or sticking him with her knitting needles and things like that. And these larger than life personalities that are filling the screen make it a perfect topic for something like television. And you have George with his golden locks that just stand out on TV on black and white. Um, it's ideal programming to have on black and white TV. And again, it works both from a local angle and from a national angle. And between that and the primetime boxing, You have four networks. Each network has its own boxing show. Some of them, I think ABC usually had more than one because they needed the programming. So you have boxing every night of the week except Sunday. You have five, maybe 6 nights of boxing every week. And you have all the fights, not just the major fights, the championship title fights, because it isn't until the mid 50s that those even start to think of going to pay per view in the movie theaters. So you have all the heroes of boxing, but you also have all the up and coming stars that are being fed into the system to work their way up the ladder. Now, you know, boxing is not an honest sport in the 1940s and 50s. So you have fixed fights, you have fighters who are being targeted for stardom, but to our point, you're seeing all of those fighters rising up through the ranks on television. Television is making them stars and creating their following so that there will be the interest when they make it to the big time and fight for the title. And that's the kind of built-in audience that a group like the National Boxing Association was able to build through their stable of fighters in order to be able to make the shows a ratings hit, and they were tremendously thrilling TV. You had heavy investment by Gillette in the Friday night fights, as well as in the World Series, in the Rose Bowl when that came onto TV. Gillette was the major sponsor of sports on television with their cavalcade of sports, and so of all the sports, I think you're right that wrestling and boxing were the two that in the early days of television most lent themselves to natural stardom. But by the end of the 40s, you have the World Series on TV. You have the Yankees playing the Dodgers. You have Mel Allen, the Yankee announcer, becoming one of the early stars of television, just like Arthur Godfrey or Ed Sullivan or Buffalo Bob Smith, because the Yankees are in the series and people are become familiar with Mel Allen. He becomes a star as well.
Um, One of the things looking at the 1948 to 49 programming is that Saturday especially was a black hole. It's 90% local programming. So when you had so little on in prime time from the networks, I know as a kid growing up, we had things like Chiller Theater, Creature
Mhm.
Feature, The $1 Million Movie. I remember ba 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 the opening, and it would show something from the 40s. So on these Saturdays, were local programs like that being shown? In the 50s, we did get Vampira, who famously is in Plan 9 from outer space. Um, but what was filling that? Was it similar to what the networks were making? And was there a summer rerun season in the 40s?
As far as the Saturday morning programming, you didn't really have the cartoon shows that we would see coming on by the end of the 50s. Most of what you had
Well,
station
I'm talking Saturday prime time,
Saturday
mostly.
prime time. I'm sorry. Yeah, Saturday prime time. You had variety shows. I think the your show of shows, the show with Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca was a big early variety show. You had other um, spectaculars. That was another Pat Weaver phrase. And if you look at the history of television, Pat Weaver's always going to be a big name in it because he came up with so many of these ideas. But Saturday night was thought of as a special night. Nowadays, we look at Saturdays as a TV wasteland. Nobody stays home to watch TV. You have sporting events on most of the time where you have reruns. But back in the day, that was a special night because you'd have friends over to watch TV with you. They might not have a TV of their own, or you might have all gone in together, 6 or 8 of you, to buy one TV, and that would be the TV that everybody would come over and watch on Saturday nights. So Saturday was a special TV night. That was when people would get together and watch these kinds of things. And it was, it was TV gets kind of a bad rap at some point for for creating individuality, and people stay home to watch TV. But at least in its origins, TV was a social creature, and it encouraged people to get together. Whether you were watching sports or you were watching variety specials, or later on when you'd be watching something like Saturday Night at the Movies, that was special stuff. So that really did cause people to get together on Saturday nights. Um, you asked about the reruns. Yeah, you did have reruns with variety shows. However, you had reruns with filmed shows. That's the important thing, because in the 40s, certainly most of your programming is live, and so rather than having reruns, because you don't really have the sophisticated nature of videotape yet. Um, when you had a successful program, and the biggest shows in that era were the dramatic anthologies, Playhouse 90, Studio One, Philco, Kraft Television Theater, Hallmark Hall of Fame later on. When you had a show that made a particular impact, and I would throw out, just as an example, Rod Serling's drama Patterns, which was all about corporate intrigue. It was a huge sensation when it was on, and so they couldn't show it again. They didn't really have videotape. They had Kinescope, which is how they would get the shows out to the West Coast. But what did you do when you had a show that met with such critical acclaim? Well, you staged it again. And so a few weeks after Patterns was on, they did the whole thing over again live with the same cast for people who had missed it the first time. That's the kind of way that that was your version of reruns at that point in time. And so rather than having the rerun season, if you were if you were a big star like Red Skelton, you didn't work summers. And so you had a summer replacement series. It would be another variety show with maybe an up and coming star, or it would be later on a very popular summer replacement show would be a 13-week series of failed pilots. So they weren't good enough to make it onto the fall schedule, but they're very good at becoming kind of their own mini anthology series. But you had those kinds of shows that they would use in the summer to fill the time when the biggest stars would be taking the summer off. And then you had sports and other things like that as well. But it was really quite a different environment when you consider the magic of live television. You did have live anthologies that did 52 weeks a year, different show every week. You had a show like What's My Line, which is actually going to bridge the 50s and the 60s. It's on for 17 and a half years. But in 17 and a half years, they never ran a rerun. The show was only preempted maybe 24 times for other programming. Um, that's staggering. Over 700 episodes of that show, every one of them original. So that was the environment of TV, and the show was live. So that was the environment of TV at that point in time, live programming, and not just live because it was necessary, but live because a lot of the pioneers of television, say a director like John Frankenheimer, who would move on to become a very big movie director, but he cut his teeth on TV. They felt that there was an electricity about live television. It was the closest thing that the audience would get to live theater. And so they didn't want a perfect program. They didn't want a perfect production where they could do a retake if somebody flubbed a line. They wanted the intensity that came from having a one-shot opportunity at the program. And so that was what television was like. Very different environment.
Looking at the schedule for the 49-50 season, right at the turn, there seems to have been in that just that one year from 48-49 to 49-50, the flowering of scripted television. There's a few dramas, but some notable sitcoms were The Goldbergs and The
Hmm.
Maury Amsterdam Show, and then the first iteration of The Life of Riley on television, not with the more well-known version of William Bendix, but with Jackie Gleason. I remember as a kid in the early to mid '70s on summer nights, from 11 o'clock till midnight, in New York on WPIX, I think it was. They had The Honeymoon as the classic 39, and then
Hmm.
at 11:30 you'd have The Life of Riley with Jackie Gleason playing. I still remember the whistling theme song. It would go do 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 do, and that was the first show I'd ever seen from the 1940s. I'm looking at it, I'm thinking like there's going to be dinosaurs on it, you know. um, but talk about what led to the rise of scripted television, both sitcoms and dramas, uh, right? Really, in just a 1 year period, if you know.
Well, I know. I can't speak for certain about the industry as a whole, but I know that that one of the shows, and I guess this is a little later than that particular time, but one of the shows that you look at that really makes a difference, I think, is I Love Lucy, because um, that shows the ability to be able to do programs on film. And film becomes a very popular way of being able to do a drama, to do a regular series, and be able to use it not only on a national basis, but you're going to be able to syndicate it later on. You're going to be able to show it in reruns. So that becomes a very popular way of programming. And I think another thing to consider is that by the time we get to the 1949 50 era, you've got a new band, if you will, of stars that have been developed. You've got Jackie Gleason, who had started out on Cavalcade of Stars and then moves to Life of Riley. Gleason now is a big enough star so that he's a bona fide TV star. Milton Berle is a bona fide TV star. And you've got people like that who can establish themselves and have their own programs. But a show like the Goldbergs, ethnic humor, it's very popular at that point in time. Again, people listening to the radio are used to ethnic humor, so you've got a lot of fans from something like that. But the Goldbergs is a very interesting show too, because it illustrates a couple of things. It illustrates the dynamics of assimilation, of first generation immigrants assimilating into American culture. And by the same token, it's a great message for the the United States as a whole, the Cold Warrior thing, which you can't really minimize. With the Cold War going on, the Goldbergs is proof, as are the Honeymooners and many other shows of their type, proof that you can work your way up in America, that you can succeed, that there are not things that are that you can't achieve. And so, it plays into that whole idea of in this country, anyone can grow up to be president. Well, I don't know that anyone ever truly believed that, but they understood what that meant. And so I think that you had series like this with recurring characters that were proving to come through in a couple of different ways. They were weekly entertainment, and at the same time, they were what sponsors and networks, they had the message that we wanted to get out, and that as America began importing, or I should say exporting shows to other countries, they were containing that kind of message that we wanted other people to see.
Yeah, I want to talk about a few of the shows. I was just looking up the show You Bet Your Life.
Mm-hmm.
which was Groucho Marx. Now it started on it says NBC here in 1947 on radio, and it moved right there, the October 15th of '49 onto television. So it just catches the tail end of the '40s. Um, uh, you had mentioned earlier that a lot of the movie stars that were big in the 1940s wanted nothing to do with television. Now Groucho was, a star going back to the 20s and 30s in
Mm-hmm.
film. Uh, did his did a name of that stature still at that time? Do you think that that had an effect in terms of drawing talent to television? Because oftentimes television, even into the '60s or whatnot, was looked down on. A movie star like
Yeah.
Elizabeth Taylor was always bigger than a TV star like Lucille Ball.
Right, and often a movie star like Paul Newman would have come from TV, but
Mm,
you rarely saw vice versa.
yeah.
So I wouldn't doubt that Groucho was able to exert some kind of an influence. People were able to see that Groucho was just as big a star as he had ever been, that he was being introduced, in fact, to an entirely new audience of young people who might not have remembered his movies, who weren't into revival houses or things like that, and they were discovering a completely different Groucho, but one that people who did remember Groucho would still recognize. So Groucho, and of course the idea of You Bet Your Life, ostensibly it's a quiz show, but it isn't really. It's a vehicle for Groucho, and
Mm.
Groucho's there to do his shtick and to play off of his guests and to do these interviews that most people would remember if they think about the show today. Or you'd have the duck drop down from the ceiling, say the magic void. I would think that I don't know this for a fact, but I would think that Groucho would be proof that you could come on television after having a big career in the movies and that you would still be able to retain, I don't want to say your dignity because that's a loaded word when you talk about an entertainer like Groucho in terms of his act, but you could retain your status. That's the way I would put it.
Yeah, I know. If you look at YouTube clips from the show, though, I mean, the stuff, 70 plus years later, it's still fresh. I mean,
Oh, I love
Groucho,
it. Yeah.
Groucho's double entendres and the way he'd lift an eyebrow, just,
Hmm.
it's amazing what he got away with if you actually thought about it. But a couple of other shows that, for me, and I'll ask what shows are on your sort of range there. Candid Camera. I remember Alan
Hmm.
Funt in the late '60s, early '70s. That show ran for like 30 plus years.
Yeah.
And Kukla, Fran, and Ollie as a kids show, I remember ran. I guess it ran during the weekdays
Hmm.
in the '40s, but in when I was growing up in the '70s, it was a Sunday morning show in New York. What shows, if you want anything about those two shows or any of the other shows that stand out in the late '40s to you?
Well, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie is a great example because that was, again, ostensibly a kid's show, and it had great appeal to kids because the puppets are fun. And Fran Allison, the human in the Kukla, Fran, and Ollie equation, is a terrific hostess. But that has a very sophisticated level of humor in it, and it develops this huge fan following of people who are really well known that we wouldn't think of as following just a kid's show. You've got Orson Welles, Tallulah Bankhead, John Steinbeck, all watch Kukla, Fran, and Ollie every day or whenever they can. They're huge fans of the program. They write fan letters, things like that. They do a version of the Mikado on Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. They have what they call the Kuklapolitan Players, which is the formal name for all of the puppets. And when they do a musical presentation, it's the Kuklapolitan Opera. And And so that's an example of a show that has such a strong appeal to both adults and kids. It's kind of the opposite of Howdy Doody, which adults will remember fondly from when they were kids, but it wasn't necessarily a show that adults would flock to as well. So I love Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. I think that's a great example of a show that's really big back then. And Candid Camera actually made the journey from radio when it was called Candid Microphone. But it was amazing what Alan Funt could get away with on that show. That he was when he was doing these pranks, for example, the singer Dorothy Collins, who was a popular guest on his show, she'd be out there with a car that doesn't start. And so she's waving to motorists for help, and motorists get out. They lift up the trunk or the hood, and they found out there's no engine in there. Smile, you're on a Canon camera. Funt is really depending on the kindness of strangers, that nobody gets upset over being punked on network television. So that is a great show, both as a segment on the Gary Moore Show and as a standalone. When Funt has his own half hour for it, those are wonderful shows from the era. There's one show that I think is always interesting to talk about, because it's considered the first TV sitcom, and it's much more sophisticated in a way than we think. It's called Mary Kay and Johnny, and it debuts in 1947. It's the first American television sitcom, and contrary to what you might think, contrary to what most people would believe, in 1948, I think it is, they run an episode with Mary Kay and Johnny. They're a husband and wife team. I think they're married in real life as well, but they play a husband and wife on the show. They are the first couple to ever share a bed on television. Some people think, oh, it was the Flintstones. Oh, it was Dick Van Dyke. Oh, it was this or that or the other. No, it actually goes back as far as 1948. So before we're out of the 50s, we've already had a married couple in a sharing a bed. And that doesn't become the norm, but it shows a certain, I think, very interesting sophistication about it. Look, the actress Mary Kay in real life is pregnant. They can't cover it up anymore by having her stand behind a sofa. She's going to have a baby. So they go with the natural understanding of that people are going to be able to figure this out, and they're going to get it, and they're going to be all right with it. So, when we were talking about the norms of TV in the 40s, and you think of the idea of the TV being so strict that they wouldn't even allow a married couple to be in the same bed. And while that is true in the 40s and the 50s and even into the 60s, here we've got a show right there in the 40s that shows it. It's fascinating. Whenever I think of that period, the two things that I think about are the great television anthology shows and the shows that we touched on, the variety shows. I think of the anthology shows, not just the most famous ones, which I would say are probably Playhouse 90 and Studio One, but you also had shows sponsored by Philco. You had Robert Montgomery, one of the first big movie stars to get involved in television. He had a show called Robert Montgomery Presents. And yes, Robert Montgomery is the father of Elizabeth Montgomery. And Robert Montgomery hosted this anthology series. He occasionally acted in it himself, but he was mostly the host. He was also a movie star. He was also Dwight Eisenhower's media advisor when Eisenhower became president. Montgomery worked a lot with him on how to present himself on television. So we're seeing the growing influence of TV even there. But you have these drama series that are dealing with classic television show with the classics you're seeing a lot of adaptations of Shakespeare or Eugene O'Neill or other playwrights, but they're also serving as this breeding ground for some great writers of the future. I mentioned Rod Serling. He got his start writing for anthology shows. Paddy Chayefsky, Reginald Rose, who wound up doing The Defenders on TV. His most famous movie script is probably 12 Angry Men, but that actually appeared on television before it appeared on the big screen. So you had these anthology shows who were bringing tremendous talent, the writers, the directors, like as I mentioned earlier, the actors, somebody like Paul Newman or Charlton Heston, or even Grace Kelly. They're getting time on these anthologies, and they're honing their performances and becoming it's becoming that clearinghouse to get them to the big screens where most of them wanted to be. Um, Texaco Star Theater, I think you've got to mention because of Burl. Because Milton Berle is seen as Mr. Television, the first person ever to have that title. And he's also given credit for selling so many TV sets, although I think, as you say, Gorgeous George sold even more. But Burl was a huge star. He had been a so-so vaudevillian. He had been on the radio and had been a moderate success. But he catapults to fame on television because of his sight gags, his willingness to do bits in drag, to wear a barrel right after tax day. He wears a barrel because that's all he's got left after the government's taken his taxes. It's a frantic show. It's outrageous show. Burl becomes the first TV star, and he really establishes the idea that television can create stars. And then we go on to, as you pointed out, Jackie Gleason and others. So you've got to look at Texaco Star Theater. I've seen some episodes of it. Yeah, it's okay. It's an acquired taste. The Colgate Comedy Hour, which comes along later, has Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis are probably the most famous of their rotating panel of hosts. I mean, even Bob Hope hosted Colgate Comedy Hour. But as far as thinking of just the hosts of that show, Dean and Jerry are probably the most famous. Al Jolson hosts it. Again, those are shows that are of their time. And one of the things that I do want to mention that I don't want to, as a television historian, as a cultural historian, I don't want to short sight this part of the equation. And it's kind of easy to get caught up in some of this and forget about it until afterwards. But when you watch these shows, you'll see skits that go on for 6, 7, 8, 10 minutes. Even on your show of shows with Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca, you'll see very long set pieces. Now, that points to that the audience at the time certainly had a longer attention span than they do today. Even at that point in time, there were critics who would say the skit goes on maybe a little too long, but people were willing to sit and watch a 10-minute skit. They were willing to do that on a regular basis because it was television and because it was special. But it did. We'll watch that today. I watch Martin Lynn Lewis on the Comedy Hour. They're very funny. But you do look at your watch sometimes and you wonder how they're going to get this. You know, they keep going off in different directions, and you see maybe 3 or 4 different places where the skit could end and it doesn't. And you say, yeah, this is going a little too long maybe. And then when it does end, sometimes the ending isn't particularly satisfying. Well, we're looking at that through our own eyes and through our own filters of what we're accustomed to today. We're not looking at it through the way people looked at it back then when they were so excited that they would watch anything that was on TV. And so a 10-minute skit was nothing. And I think is important to point out when we talk about genres and everything, but we also talk about or should talk about how TV really was different. You Another example of this, you had a series called NBC Opera Theater, which is exactly what you would expect it to be. There were live operas that were staged on television, usually on Sunday afternoons, for maybe 90 minutes. They were often translated into English, which doesn't really matter. I love opera, but I will tell you this, that it is very difficult to understand people singing in English unless they have subtitles, and they didn't have them on TV back then. But it was again something that people wanted to see or that they were being exposed to that does you don't see on TV anymore. It's a genre change, but it's also this idea that there was an element of middlebrow television. It wasn't lowbrow, wasn't highbrow either. It was something that could appeal to the average person. Ed Sullivan was the king of middlebrow entertainment. Opera stars appeared on his show more than any other individuals because they were in New York, they were with the Met, they were available, but also because Sullivan thought that was something good to be able to present to TV. So you've got a star like Marilyn Horne, an American-born soprano, who is as cute as a button when she makes her debut at the Met. She's in her early 20s. She becomes a superstar. She's on Sullivan more than anybody else, and you've got this general programming that is very different from what we're used to today. And it's because we've changed, it's because television has changed, and it's because they were experimenting back then with whatever they could do. They were willing to try everything, anything, and see if it would stick. And so you're going to show an opera on TV? Why not? You're going to show these live dramas written for TV? Why not? Let's try something new. Anything is possible. That was kind of the mantra back then, that anything is possible. And I think if we've gotten away from anything over the years, it's that we don't have that same mentality anymore. You do see a lot of things on television that are bold, that are different, but you don't really see anything experimental. I don't think it is that you don't see anything. I think you've certainly got some of the prestige shows that would have to be called revolutionary in their approach to the way they incorporate audiences into the drama. Fleabag, for example. But for all of that, there was a creativity and an energy and the willingness to try anything that meant you could start out at a local station as the janitor sweeping floors, and in 3 months you could be the program director. That was where the opportunities were, and I think that's what makes it such an exciting point in time to look back at, even if the programming isn't always as interesting as we would think it should be. It was still just an amazing time in television history.
Before we wrap up, Mitch, I just wanted to step back a moment and talk a little bit about that Mary Kay and Johnny show.
Mm,
The interesting thing in looking at it is it ran for only 3 years, 47, 48, 48, 49, and then 1950. And yet it was on three of the four networks.
yeah.
Dumont, it originated. CBS, it ran in 49 concurrently, apparently, with NBC. Uh, uh, and so if this show was the first sitcom, and maybe it wasn't the best quality from what I'm reading here, but
Mhm.
why was it so forgotten? Why do so many people think of, if people think of it at all, the Goldbergs, but usually sitcoms begin with Lucille Ball in most
Yeah.
people's minds. Why do you think this show was forgotten?
Probably the easiest and most obvious answer would be because we don't have kinescopes of it, because it didn't survive as something that we would see over and over again. And I think that when you talk about Lucy, the contribution that Lucy and Desi made to television history by filming the show, by using multiple cameras, by working in California, syndicating the program, I think that more even than the quality of the show, it was that understanding of its value as a commodity that made it memorable, that made it important in television history. And I think the fact that Mary Kay and Johnny, if it does exist, you might have one or two episodes of it, you might have clips of it somewhere, but by and large, it's a lost show. And things disappear from memory when you don't have constant reminders of them. The other thing about Mary Kay and Johnny specifically is that their stars were not big names. They didn't have big careers either before or after the program. It was during the program that they would be well known. And if you don't have repetition, you don't have memory. And one thing I would say, just tangential to that, is that if you were to ask most Americans today about the assassination of John F. Kennedy and to remember something about it, they remember Walter Cronkite making the announcement, takes his glasses off, his mouth trembles a little bit, puts them back on, makes the announcement that President Kennedy is dead. That's perhaps the most memorable image of the day of the assassination. And yet, when you look back at TV of that time, NBC had a 2-to-1 advantage over CBS in terms of people watching the assassination coverage. More people watched Huntley and Brinkley than Cronkite as a news program. And as far as the JFK coverage was concerned, more people watched NBC than CBS and ABC combined. Yet we don't remember that today. Why is it? It's probably because CBS was brilliant at understanding the value of leveraging all of that footage. So whenever you have a show like Mad Men or any show that's depicting the assassination coverage, invariably it'll be a CBS clip they show. Whenever you see a retrospective of the news, who are they showing? Walter Cronkite on there. I don't want to say that CBS marketed the assassination. That would not only be gauche, but I think it would be unfair to them. But they understood the value that that footage has. NBC did not. They have Robert McNeil talking via telephone to Frank McGee in the studio, and McGee relaying McNeil's words to the audience because they don't have because McGee can hear McNeil, the audience can't, so he has to relay the words to him from the phone. That's not It's not spectacular coverage. NBC, maybe understandably, doesn't utilize that, but CBS has the great coverage. They do utilize it. As a result, that's what we remember. So when you look at a show like Mary Kay and Johnny or so many of the other shows of that era, and we ask why they stuck or didn't stick, I think it's because of the availability. The Goldbergs exists. UCLA's Film and Television Museum has a lot of the episodes. You can see them on something like Jewish network television. You can see them on YouTube. You can, if you've heard of them, you can find them. If you haven't heard of them and you have any interest in old television, you'll probably run across them. So sometimes the most groundbreaking shows, the shows that are most worthy of being remembered, aren't necessarily the ones that we think of because they're gone. And that opens up a whole nother kettle of fish that we can talk about someday, which is the question of television's failure to recognize itself as an artistic medium worth saving.
Yeah,
That's something we can talk about another day, but
absolutely.
that's a big sticking point for me with the history of television.
Yeah, and we've seen it nowadays with the internet. Look at, for example, things like the Internet Archive or Wikipedia. Uh, they will People who are doing interesting things on the internet are can't get a page on Wikipedia. But if you're someone like PewDiePie who gets 25 million views per video for
Yeah.
crap, he's there. But in 50 years, will anyone remember them? Who knows? So the 1950s here in television, we're going to have the live television, the game shows, the quiz shows, Ed Sullivan, Gleason, Lucille Ball, people we've mentioned. What, just that sort of as a preview, if you could
Hmm.
pick the one thing that you're most interested in talking about the 1950s television in America, what would that be coming up?
I think it will be something that you and I have discussed previously, the golden age of television.
Hmm.
Was it really golden, or do we just remember it that way? And to the extent that it was golden, what was it that made it so golden? Why is it that people remember the 50s with a certain awe that they don't remember other decades? And why is it that when people talk about the golden age of television today, they're thinking about the 2000s? Why aren't they thinking about the 50s? That I think is the key to the next decade.